There's a crisis brewing in Canada behind the scenes, and the political and financial elite in the country, and around the world for that matter, are very aware of a major problem that we're facing. A problem that impacts Canadians and our money, our jobs, our real estate, investments, our pensions, and our overall quality of life entirely. Today, I believe our politicians are actively trying to prepare for this future without alarming Canadians in the meantime by pushing forward policies that address this major long-term problem while simultaneously benefiting corporations and the already wealthy in the short term. Now, there's been a lot of talk about immigration policy lately, but not nearly enough talk about the real incentives that are driving those policies. This all ties in together. So let's break down how this system's working, the major issue on our horizon, and how all of this impacts you directly. First, let's start with what has just happened, and then we'll expand into the extremely disheartening way that Canada is set up for failure, and how our politicians and financial elite are doing their very best to keep it on life support all the same. You might have caught this video that was put out just last week, a video posted in a very YouTuber-style format of Trudeau trying to explain to Canadians why all of a sudden they've flipped on their immigration policy, flipped it entirely on its head, going from an extremely open stance that was a cornerstone of the Liberal platform in 2016 when he was first elected, to now saying that Canada's population should stay flat over the next 3 years.
Looking back, when the post-pandemic boom cooled and businesses no longer needed the additional labor help, as a federal team, we could have acted quicker and turned off the taps faster.
Now, it is time to make the adjustments to stabilize the immigration system that we need and get it working right for Canadians for right now.
So he admits that they should have slowed down immigration sooner, but he still thinks that heavily leveraging temporary foreign workers was the right call. As the economy reopened after the pandemic, businesses had trouble hiring staff at the wages that those businesses were willing to pay, so they got loud about it.
We field calls from businesses, CEOs, economic experts, all sharing their thoughts on where we should set our targets.
We've had a chronic shortage of labor for the last decade. It is the #1 issue of all manufacturers across Canada. So we think there needs to be more, push the pedal to the floor to bring more people into Canada, because
Ontario is facing a generational labor shortage. 380,000 jobs are going unfilled.
And the government listened, and they broadly opened up the temporary foreign worker program in April of 2022, specifically removing caps on low-wage temporary foreign workers. But if you've watched this channel before, you'll know that we've talked about how a number of experts believe that this mass intervention in the labor market also resulted in the suppression of wages, keeping wages lower than they otherwise would have been. And businesses could now rely on the cheap labor of foreign workers, exploitable foreign workers, who were willing to take on low-paying work because they believed it would help them get the permanent resident status that they wanted. So now businesses didn't need to respond to the signals of the job market by increasing wages for Canadians. Instead, they could just rely on new low-wage workers. It's a pretty sweet deal if you're a business. But nowhere in Trudeau's video does he make reference to this impact on what Canadians get paid. Nowhere in the video does he take any accountability for that aspect of things, despite some people within his own Liberal Party recognizing this reality. Now, here's a clip from Nate Erskine-Smith's podcast with Michael Scudderud, who is a labor economics professor at the University of Waterloo. Nate's a current Liberal member of Parliament who will not be running for re-election, and it seems to be reasonably so, distancing himself from some of these rather questionable policies.
I came across your work because of my frustrations at the time, where I think it was the spring of 2022, and we were rapidly expanding the temporary foreign worker program, and you were writing critically about it, and that writing really spoke to me, and really around the suppression or the downward trajectory of low-income wages because of the expansion and wide expansion of that program.
But not only did this have an impact on wages, I also think that this could have made one of Canada's biggest issues even worse. We have a huge productivity issue in Canada, something that the Bank of Canada Deputy Governor says is an emergency situation. We have issues with the amount that each person produces in the economy. That amount is shrinking along with the average Canadian's pay and quality quality of life. And with Canada's reliance on getting cheap labor from other sources, Canada's businesses are also not incentivized to innovate and to invest to increase how productive each of their workers are. Since they don't have to pay workers all that much, they can then rely on growing profits by expanding their workforce instead of growing profits by making their existing workforce better. It's my personal belief that when you mess with the labor market, a whole lot of stuff can get a little bit screwy. In a moment, we'll talk about the direct way that the government has benefited from these dramatic policies and how their recent U-turn could start the whole negative cycle over again, and how organizations of global financial elite are pushing hard towards a singular goal. But all of the past few minutes was just to say that Canadians may be a lot better off if we could increase productivity by incentivizing new Canadian businesses that make our economy more efficient. Businesses like the sponsor of today's video, a business that can save you a lot of money, and that is ShipLink. If you ever buy anything online, you obviously know you have to pay sales tax on what you purchase. But what you may not know is that this tax is lower in certain provinces. In the Atlantic provinces, you pay 15%. In Ontario, it's 13%. BC's 12%. But in Alberta, it's only 5% GST because there's no provincial tax there. And ShipLink is going to help you get this lower tax rate regardless of where in Canada you live. When you sign up for your free ShipLink account, you get your own address at their warehouse locations in Alberta and Quebec, where you can have your packages delivered so that you only pay 5% GST. Now, you also get an address in the US, which has a ton of uses, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. So here I have 2 packages that have arrived at the ShipLink warehouse. Now from their dashboard, once I declare the contents of my package as I've done here, I can then either collect my goods in person at their warehouse by selecting hold for pickup, or I can easily forward the package to my home address or any other address for that matter by selecting forward package or cross-border forward. But the really beautiful thing is that I can have multiple items delivered to their warehouse where I can then combine them into a single package using this consolidate function so that I only have to pay shipping once. So you end up saving money by only paying the 5% sales tax, and then those savings outweigh the costs of the extra shipping step from ShipLink's warehouses to your front door. But you can also take advantage of their US-based warehouse. You already know that a lot of US-based businesses offer free shipping in the US, but then charge hefty fees the minute you want to send something to Canada, if they even offer shipping to Canada at all. So take advantage of that free shipping and get items sent to your personal ShipLink warehouse address in New York, only paying the 5% Canadian federal tax, and then simply use the cross-border forward option or the forward package option features to send it wherever you like. You simply click forward package, you enter your address, and then from there you can see all of the different shipping options and you can compare them and see which one's cheapest. This is also an incredible option for Canadians who sell to people in the US. ShipLink only charges $2 to cross a package from Canada to US from their Montreal warehouse, and you're just not going to beat a price like that. And because ShipLink does so much shipping, they get and then pass along to you a discounted shipping rate that you just wouldn't be able to get on your own. So whether you're buying within Canada and want to take advantage of that sweet 5% sales tax by using your new ShipLink address in Alberta, or if you want to take advantage of the free US shipping by sending your packages to the New York warehouse, well, you're going to end up saving money on what you're buying when you use ShipLink. So make sure to use the link in the description and to sign up for your ShipLink account with the referral code Russell, that's RUSSELL. Making an account is free, so get in there and take a look at how you could be saving a bunch of money, all while supporting an awesome Canadian business. It's something that I think everyone should be using, so thanks again to ShipLink for sponsoring today's video. So we've talked about how by listening to the business community that the government suppressed wages and may have even disincentivized productivity increasing innovations. But there's a much bigger problem than a labor shortage, a much bigger problem that I believe the government is actually trying to address, even if they're not saying so out loud. Now we'll touch on that soon, but first we need to understand the risks of the massive immigration U-turn that the federal government has just planned.
Between the amount of people coming and going, we'll effectively pause population growth for the next 2 years. Then from 2027 onwards, it'll balance out and slowly start increasing again at a sustainable pace. In fact, that gets us back to the population growth path we were on before the pandemic.
So the pendulum swings the other way. Now that the international students and temporary foreign workers aren't needed, when their permits expire, they'll be sent home. And this is fine by businesses because we're in a different economic environment than we were in 2022. Today, due to the interest rate hiking actions of the Bank of Canada over the past 2 years, the economy's cooled down, it's slowed down, and businesses have contracted. They've gotten smaller, and those businesses need fewer workers, and there are fewer jobs available, so businesses are not really forced to increase wages to attract Canadian workers that are already looking for a job. But it does make me question if this whole cycle won't just happen over and over again. Now the central banks are lowering interest rates, trying to increase activity and growth in the economy. If this works, then demand for workers might increase, but it will be in an environment where there's no more cheap labor. Will these same businesses get loud once again and convince a future government to turn back on the labor taps, to bring back in more foreign workers, or some other solution? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. But at the moment, there's some evidence that some of the temporary workers and international students who have been exploited by the government and business community, well, those same people won't be made expendable so easily.
Some temporary residents may turn to our asylum system when their visa expires as a shortcut to stay in Canada. Those claims will be analyzed and processed, and if their claim fails, they'll be sent home.
And this makes sense. People who would otherwise be forced to leave the country are now turning to their last resort, claiming asylum in Canada, a status that's meant for people coming from a war-torn country where their lives are at risk if they were to return, which is not the case for most foreign workers and international students. But even with an illegitimate claim, which Trudeau says will be processed and then denied if it's illegitimate, well, it's not a bad option for the rightfully upset foreign workers who were sold a false bill of goods. Here's a clip from Rula Eatrides, who's the head of the Refugee Division of Immigration Canada, explaining the reality of the situation. She was just asked the question, well, what's the average processing time once someone submits an asylum claim?
Currently, it's 14 months. We're funded for about 60,000 finalizations this year, but with the intake right now at over 200,000 claims, the wait time for a claim that's coming in now will be about 44 months. It's the highest volume that the IRB has had.
So if a person with a temporary work visa doesn't want to leave the country if they can't achieve permanent resident status, well then they can take advantage of a backlogged refugee processing system, which will allow them to remain in and to continue working in the country for 44 months while their claim's being processed. That's over 3.5 years.
If I go back to India, I'll be surely getting from the, sorry for the language, but from the depression, sir. Because I have so much loan on my parents had tried, they are still paying it. I can go try finding cash jobs. If I don't, then I'll apply for the refugee status and I can work legally on the refugee status.
Means like you don't have, refugee means that you have a threat on your life and back home country, then asylum comes.
Yes.
So you are a student.
Yes.
You don't have a status.
Yes.
You are thinking to apply for a refugee. Is there not something, because government said they may reject many applications of the refugees, there's a fake refugees.
Yeah, yes, but it's like they can't stop me from filing the refugee, right? And
yes, they can't stop you.
They can't stop me. And the second thing, I'll get a work permit and I'll be able to work the full time legally. So
I think this is likely the route that a lot of people will take, and it's hard to blame them for it. For many of these temporary foreign workers, well, their families have gone into debt to send them to Canada, maybe to send them to an international student program at one of the colleges in Canada, with the idea that they'll be able to get permanent resident status to make this debt worth it. If in this situation, they can claim asylum, and even if it's fraudulent, you get to stay for 3.5 years and work unrestricted. And the worst case scenario is your claim gets denied and then you just go home then like you would otherwise do now. And the best case scenario, maybe immigration policy changes yet again and the situation changes while you're waiting and you have another crack at getting permanent resident status. So there are some concerns with the government's immigration policy of the past years in terms of serving business interests, suppressing wages, and possibly making the productivity issues worse while masking Canada's struggling economy by propping up our GDP numbers. But this is where it gets interesting, because I think that there's a bigger concern, a concern or an issue that I believe is being addressed that's more important to politicians than short-term needs of businesses to get workers. You see, the government is being heavily lobbied by multiple groups saying that we need to dramatically increase our population. Otherwise, our social safety nets like old age security or our public pension plans, the value of real estate and Canadian companies, all of that could be at risk. This all centers around a concept called the dependency ratio, or the amount of working age, tax-paying, pension-contributing Canadians compared to the amount of non-working retirees. Now, not so long ago, there were about 6 workers for every retiree, but today, there's only 2 workers for every retired person.
Our population is aging, we're having fewer children, and our workforce participation is shrinking. Our birth rate is actually at the lowest level it's been in 100 years. In the next 15 years, seniors are expected to make up 25% of our population. And by 2068, the number of dependents for every 100 Canadians of working age could be more than 70.
You just heard from Lisa Lalonde, the CEO of the Century Initiative, an organization that we've talked about on the channel before that lobbies and advocates for a far higher rate of population growth. There are some questionable incentives here and benefits that accrue to some of the largest global asset management organizations in the world, but their base concerns have some merit. In the system as it is today, we require a forever growing population to sustain systemic stability.
So it's crystal clear that our aging population and failure to build poses very serious consequences for our country. Because if these trends continue without any kind of intervention, we will be unable to support our seniors, we won't have enough workers to support a globally competitive economy, and we simply won't have the money that we need to afford high-quality public services.
One of the objectives is around the dependency ratio, and we have an aging population, and obviously the aging population, there are 2 consequences to that. We are spending a great deal. You look at, we were just going through this old age security debate in Parliament right now, but we're spending $80 billion this year on old age security, and that's going to increase to $100 billion in just 4 years' time. And there are costs obviously associated with making sure that seniors rightly live in dignity, but there's also a increasingly smaller working age population in terms of a tax base to sustain that. And so the dependency ratio is a challenge.
But there's a lot more than just old age security that's impacted by this rapidly changing dependency ratio. It's all kinds of Ponzi-like systems that require constant growth to maintain the status quo. We look at things like the Canada Pension Plan. If it weren't for the changes made in the late 90s, the pension would be entirely unsustainable with today's dependency ratios, with the amount of workers relative to retirees. It wouldn't be sustainable without drastically and continually increasing the amount that average Canadians pay into it. But they did make some changes, and the big change was that in addition to raising the contribution rate from 3.6% to around 9% of Canadians' earnings, they created an independent investment organization called the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which now seeks a higher rate of return on Canadians' contributions by investing their money all around the world. But even with this increased contribution rate and investment strategy, as of 2021, well, the fund has about $1.1 trillion worth of payments that it needs to make to today's currently working Canadians once they retire that they don't currently have on hand. The idea is that the growth of the investments of the money that Canadians contribute will eventually grow enough to fulfill these obligations. And it is going in the right direction, as we can see here, as the value of their holdings are growing as a percentage of the amount that they owe to Canadians in the future. And they could perceivably make all of these payments for now and throughout the time until you retire, but unless the pension achieves the returns that they're looking for consistently over time, or unless we increase the amount of people that contribute to the plan, in other words, changing our dependency ratio, then it's easy to imagine a world where this could be a problem when something happens that prevents our government and these fund managers from kicking the can further down the road. The other element that, of course, will be impacted by high dependency ratios and possible population decline is Canadian real estate. It doesn't take a doctorate to wrap your head around the idea that if there are fewer people in Canada, well, then housing costs will probably go down as fewer people compete for the same stock of housing. That might be a little bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. If you're in your 20s to 40s and are looking to get into a house, it might not sound like such a bad thing to you. Canada's real estate is amongst the most expensive in the world, and wage growth simply has not kept up when comparing that to house price growth. But if you're the government, you see things a little bit differently. You simply can't afford to let a meaningful housing correction happen. You see, housing investment in Canada makes up a massive share of Canada's GDP, and that's one of the most heavily used metrics that tracks the performance of our economy. It's what politicians point to say, look, our economy is doing well, or maybe it's not doing so well. If housing slows, then so too does construction and remodeling of existing homes, and it also slows down mortgage broker fees and realtor fees, lawyer fees, and at the same time, a butterfly effect happens. If Canadians' home values decrease, then there's what's called a reverse wealth effect, where Canadians will pull back on their spending overall because they feel less wealthy because the value of their home has gone down. And this, in turn, reduces demand in the economy and further slows down growth from all kinds of other businesses. If you pair this decrease in GDP growth as the result of stalling real estate with the stalling of population growth, well, then all of a sudden the government's tax revenues start to decrease significantly. And that's a pretty big problem when you have an incredibly quickly growing public sector with more and more people working for the government, government agencies, or government-funded sectors. Not to mention the increased spending on contractors and the ever-growing consulting class that we've seen over the past years. Here you can see just how much more quickly the public sector has grown than the private sector has grown amidst the past 50 years plus. And we have some sort of shocking numbers here. The number of public sector employees rose from 490,000 to between 3.7 and 4.2 million between 2019 and 2024. A dramatic expansion. But the picture gets even more grim for the government, because if you have less tax revenue and you continue to have growing expenditures, well, then it also makes it hard to tie the nation's debt to any kind of reasonable anchor. Now, in past generations, the government has tried to balance budgets so that the government would not have to go into any further debt to support our various social services and government employees. But in recent years, these goalposts have been moved a little bit. Now we claim that as long as our GDP or our economic output increases faster than the amount we go into debt, well, then we're in a fiscally good position. That's the argument.
We are absolutely determined that our debt to GDP ratio must continue to decline. Our deficits must continue to be reduced. The pandemic debt we incurred to keep Canadians safe and solvent must be paid down, and it is being paid down. This is our fiscal anchor. This is a line we will not cross.
She says this is a line that they will not cross. And to be fair, they haven't crossed this line officially yet. And that's largely because of the mass temporary foreign worker program that propped up our GDP so that our debt to GDP ratio wouldn't look so bad. We'd still be tied to this fiscal anchor that says, hey, we're doing well as a government when it comes to our spending relative to our economic growth. But with a stalled population, something that's sort of coming here, or with this new immigration U-turn, well, all of that's likely to change if the government can't become drastically more efficient with its spending, or alternatively dramatically increase productivity or GDP contributions per worker. So there are some reasonable concerns around a lack of population growth, the concerns about a changing dependency ratio, fewer workers to support more retirees, and the impact that that can have on Canada and every average Canadian, especially if you're dedicated to keep the system the way it currently functions today. We'll get into some alternative thoughts in a minute, but there's even reason to believe that these demographic challenges could lead to an impending asset collapse with not enough demand to support the perpetual growth that we've grown addicted to. But I'll tell you this, A forever growing population also has some hidden incentives that I think will further expand the wealth gap between the financial elite and the average working class person. And some of the lobbying organizations can reasonably point to all of these concerns about population growth and dependency ratios, while at the same time serving the best interests of extremely wealthy investors, funds, and global asset management behemoths.
We have a really great Canada, and we're really, really lucky to be here.
I love our diversity. I love the tolerance we have for one another.
Canada's an accepting society.
Canada is a good place to raise your family.
At its root, it's a country where anybody can prosper.
That's a familiar face to a lot of people. This is Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada today. At this time, 8 years ago, he was the head of the Rotman School of Business, I believe is the name of it, at the University of Toronto. Interesting how all of these people tend to cross over.
The image of Canada is very good, it's very strong. But would that continue to be that way in next 20 to 30 years? It's an important question.
Century Initiative, for me, is about defining.
Let me pause here before he explains this. This is Mark D. Wiseman. He's one of the founders of the Century Initiative. If I raise myself up here, you'll see that he's also the global head of active equities and chairman at BlackRock Alternative Investors. Now, BlackRock is one of the largest asset managers and investment companies in the world, with over $11 trillion worth of assets under management. Now, he was also the former CEO of, yep, you guessed it, the Canadian Pension Plan and Investment Board. Now, the other founder of the Century Initiative is Dominic Barton, who is the former head of McKinsey, one of the largest corporate and government consultant agencies, and he was later appointed by Trudeau to be Canada's ambassador to China throughout the pandemic.
A great project for Canada, a project that will, by the year 2100, have a material positive difference on Canada.
The country is no longer growing in a positive way. GDP is flat to declining, our innovation's not great. And we have a demographic bulge of a lot of my generation moving through the system, moving through the pipeline, and not enough people to support them.
So as we've spent time outlining in this video, there are some serious demographic challenges that Canada faces, especially if you want the system to continue functioning in the way that it has over the past 30 years. These people aren't wrong to say that, but it also lines up very nicely with the interests of the people who have benefited the most from the structure of our social, political, and economic systems, the world's political and financial elite. Here's a list of things that happen when population perpetually grows. Well, pension plans have an easier time meeting their investment goals as demand spurs business growth, while also increasing pension fund contributions from working age people. And also, private investment firms, like BlackRock as an example, benefit from this asset growth, while also benefiting by investing in infrastructure initiatives that become more and more necessary as you have a larger and larger population. On top of that, real estate speculators experience appreciation of their assets in their land, and even more so when there's a push to emphasize density and upzoning of properties for more density. That all contributes to the increasing value of the land. And on the flip side, if populations begin shrinking, as they are in every single advanced economy if you remove immigration, well then the perpetual growth in the value of major corporations that a lot of these asset management companies are invested in, that growth is harder to justify. So there's a lot wrapped up in the incentives behind pushing for forever growth. But I also don't necessarily think that this growth actually takes into consideration the day-to-day lives of average people. When I hear incredibly well-off and well-connected people talking about the need for more people, I hear it as more of a request for more and more cheaper labor. I hear it as a means to an end of increasing our GDP and having an economy that, by the numbers, looks good. And by the numbers, this kind of economic growth is fantastic for people who are already heavily invested in assets, invested in stocks and privately owned companies, land. But I'm of the belief that the economy isn't only meant to serve those who have the means to play this big financial game, who have the money money to buy into it. The reality is that there's millions of people that are so busy working 3 jobs that they can't get into this big game of financial monopoly. And what are their true interests? Does an average Canadian care that the GDP has gone up, that Canada has increased clout on the global stage, or that stocks are performing well? What do those high-level numbers actually mean to people on the ground floor? I'd guess that most people want to just feel like they're able to provide for their families and to live a life where they do fulfilling work, but also have enough time to enjoy their lives, spending time with the people that they love. And the incessant focus on labor force participation rates and increasing the amount of old age workers and increasing the amount of households where both parents are working full time, these economic drivers that can help economic growth on a GDP level. Well, it feels like that all serves the interests of the broad economy, these big numbers, without recognizing that, at least in my eyes and hopefully yours too, the whole point of an economy is to increase the quality of life for the people inside of it. And today, it just doesn't feel like that's what's happening. And I'm not an economist or a professor. I don't have my doctorate in economics. I'm not an expert. I don't have the answers here. But I feel like an addiction to perpetual growth isn't the answer, even if the entire system is built upon that perpetual growth. Like, is it really such a bad thing? And maybe this sounds sacrilegious to some economists. Is it such a bad thing if Canada's population shrinks? If the GDP declines, God forbid? But perhaps in that situation, the output per worker could remain the same or even possibly increase due to an investment in technology to make that a reality. Like, sure, that's probably going to hurt stock prices, and it might hurt politicians' feelings if they can't point to an expanding GDP to validate their feeling of success. But does it really impact real people at the end of the day, or does it just impact these high-level numbers that maybe aren't as reflective of people's day-to-day lives? So I question the institutions that necessitate this kind of growth to exist. Like, yes, the Canada Pension Plan and old age security, those are solid social safety nets. But are they really truly sustainable? Like, can we truly, with a good conscience, promise our children and our children's children that it will be there in the same way that it is for today's older Canadians when they need it? I don't know if we can make that promise. And to what extent does the existence of such a broad social safety net, to what extent does that take the responsibility of retirement saving away from the individual, bringing them closer and closer to a reliance on the government? Is this the best way to use our resources? Or maybe some more weight and support should be given to disabled Canadians who may not have the ability to work, and maybe more personal responsibility should be left to the individual in terms of their financial future. I also worry about how this could all amplify more division in our society. Like, we've already seen mass political division, but I think that the questions we're asking today could really be a wedge between different generations. Like, will young Canadians step up and start contributing more to the CPP, Canada Pension Plan, or pay more in income taxes to support the expansion of old age security even further? Like, how will they feel about that when working age people today are already at a disadvantage when compared to previous generations when it comes to the cost of living and the cost of housing relative to the purchasing power of their incomes? And looking at the proposed solutions to our dependency ratios, well, the answer always seems to be to increase immigration. Now, there aren't many developed countries where birth rates are creating population growth. We look at Canada, we only have 1.6 births per couple. So people say, well, that birth rate is well below the rate that we would need to keep Canada's population flat, let alone increasing it. So we need to turn to immigration to solve this problem. It's always the focus on growing the population externally rather than taking a second and thinking, why is our birth rate acting how it is? Why has it gone down? Can we get to the bottom of why fewer and fewer people are having as many children? Like, I'll give credit where it's due. The expansion of the Canada Child Benefit by the Liberal government is a step in that direction. The idea that you can provide financial incentives for parents to help them have more children. But given that we're maybe like 6 or 7 years past the start of this policy, it doesn't seem to, at least yet, have made a big difference. I'd argue that the main reasons for low Canadian birth rates are both economic and social. Now, birth control and female autonomy are obviously important, of course, but there are further social elements that I think have changed and contributed to this declining birth rate. It seems to me that there's been a de-emphasization of the very real life fulfillment that you can experience by having a family. Instead, the hustle and grind, get rich and consume lifestyle, that lifestyle feels like it's pushed everywhere, while the just as, if not more legitimate path of starting a family and raising children, well, that lifestyle seems like it's gotten a lot less focus. Now, of course, there's some nuance here when we say we should have more families. Well, like typically females are most heavily leaned on for family growth, and that can lead to some problematic power imbalances between partners, where one parent feels that they can't leave an abusive situation because of financial circumstances, where perhaps one parent has focused on raising a child while the other is the sole income provider. If that child-raising person needs to leave in an abusive situation, well, they can feel like they have no financial freedom to make the decision that's best for their children. Obviously, there's nuance here, and stuff like that can be really challenging. But ultimately, I think the main thing is that more people would have kids if we weren't in such a desperate economic situation. I think fewer people are going to have kids if they aren't able to achieve a sense of stability. Like, housing is insanely expensive, partially, again, to help prop up broad economy numbers instead of serving actual people. But a heavy emphasis on urbanization, I think, has made things worse even more. This urbanization that's pushed by supporters of extreme density, further increasing housing costs, with the knock-on effect of making it less practical to have more children due to the limited space of everyone being crammed in a smaller area. There's arguments to be made that we spend less on infrastructure and transportation when we increase density, but is that juice worth the squeeze? Like, maybe if we allowed for more sprawl, more houses built farther away from urban centers and a less concentrated population, well, then maybe we'd be better able to afford our housing, and maybe we'd feel comfortable having bigger families again. I'll be clear, I don't have the answers to all of this. I'm just trying to figure out why things are the way they are, why things are happening the way they're happening, and where I see things going so that I and you can make the best decisions for you and your family and the people around you. But I'm curious what you think about all of this. What have I gotten right? What have I gotten entirely wrong? What aspects did I miss? And let me know what those are, because I'm trying to learn here. What do you think about the government's immigration changes, the previous policy, the new policy? What do you think about these ideas of we need population growth to prop up the economy so that these major institutions don't collapse? Do you think that those institutions deserve to be around if they would collapse without forever growth? I'm not sure, but let me know what you think. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. You can check out the first link the second link in the description for all the sources for this video, the email newsletter that goes out, and also check out ShipLink. They are a great Canadian company and a great sponsor, and it helps out the channel when you make an account, and it's free. So go check out ShipLink. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching this video, everybody. I really hope the video helped you out, at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.